Do I start again? I restart. Okay, apologies. Welcome to today's Housing Committee. Today the London Assembly holds its first meeting following the end of the period of mourning. We look forward now to continuing our work of scrutinising the performance of the Mayor and serving Londoners under the reign of His Majesty King Charles III. The main item on the agenda today is an investigation into the impact of planned housing reforms on London. We have some short items of business first. Members of the public may like to follow @London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag #LondonHousing for this meeting. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices. Can I ask now our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have no apologies for today's meeting.
Great. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? Can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in any specific item listed on today's agenda? Yes, Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure it's necessarily a pecuniary interest, but we are going to be discussing the private renter sector today. And so for transparency, not because I think there's a pecuniary interest, I would like it recorded that I rent out a property in the private renter sector, so I am a private renter sector landlord, so I'm quite familiar with a number of the issues relating to the private renter sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 14th of July 2022? And can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Can we note the action taken by myself as chair under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members, namely to agree the letter to the Mayor of London regarding the Kerslake review of GLA Group housing delivery, and can we note the response from the Mayor to the letter? Thank you. And that brings us to our main item of business, a discussion on the impact of government housing reforms on London, in particular social and private renting reforms and the home ownership proposals in the Levelling Up White Paper. So can I welcome our guests today to the Chamber, Geeta Nanda OBE, who's the Chief Executive of Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing and Chair of the G15, Tom Copley, the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development, and Dr. Anna Minton, who's a writer, journalist and reader in architecture at the University of East London. So I will take the first question. My first question is to you, Tom. The Mayor has expressed concerns that the Levelling Up agenda should not be about levelling down London. What impact do you think the Levelling Up agenda will have on London in its current form?
Well, first of all, good morning. It's very good to be back with you today. I'm not sure the Levelling Up agenda still exists. I'm not clear whether under Liz Truss this agenda is going to be taken forward. I think she has expressed sort of reservations about what exactly it means, and I think that we've probably collectively all been a little bit confused about what it means. But what I envisage it should mean is not levelling up that is simply geographic between north and south. It has to be a levelling up that recognises that even in the wealthiest parts of the country, and particularly in London, there is great poverty. And so levelling up needs to be not based on a crude geographic assessment. It needs to be based on helping the poorest people and the most vulnerable people in our communities. And I know you want to talk today about a number of the pieces of legislation that were proposed under the Boris Johnson government. I have heard rumours that Liz Truss intends to drop quite a bit of this legislation. I think it would be a great shame, in particular, if she were to drop the Renters Reform Bill, because although it doesn't go as far as the Mayor and I would like it to go, it does contain some policies that will really improve things for the private rented sector, including many policies actually that were proposed under the Mayor's London model. So my big concern is that as part of this new government, and particularly with this more ideological focus on free markets and things like that, we might lose some of the good things that were proposed under the last government.
Thank you, and I'm sure you know that many of us here will be pushing for the renters reform bill to
Absolutely,
go
Chair.
through.
Absolutely,
Continue to
and
chase
I
that.
think it's a really important piece of legislation.
Yeah. So, in light of the fact that you said that you're not sure that the agenda exists, how could levelling up or something similar better reflect the needs of Londoners?
Well, as I say, I think it needs to be about considering the needs of the poorest Londoners. It needs to be about big investment in housing, and particularly in social rented and council housing. It needs to be ensuring that we're getting people out of temporary accommodation and into permanent accommodation. It needs to be about ensuring that renters, as I say, are protected. They're protected from no-fault eviction. They have redress and a complaint system. There is a national database of a national property register, which is something that is proposed under this. And crucially, one of the things that has been proposed is, of course, extending the decent homes standard to the private rented sector. I think all of these things would be things that would benefit Londoners, and particularly the poorest and most vulnerable Londoners.
So I just wanted to also ask you, Tom, what steps you might take, the Assembly might, the GLA might take to mitigate the adverse effects, potential adverse effects of levelling up on London?
Well, of course, we will be continuing to use our affordable housing budgets, our 2 affordable homes programmes, the retained, the ring-fence right to buy receipts, and every pot of money that we can in order to counter some of the negative impacts about what we might see from this government. But what I would say is that we are in extremely difficult times and very choppy waters, and there are limits to what the GLA can do in that environment. And I'm concerned that there might be a move away from some of the devolution that we've seen. So, for example, if you look at what the Mayor did in terms of planning, in terms of the threshold approach, which has led to an increase of the level of affordable housing on developments that are referred to the Mayor from around 22% when he took office to 41% by habitable room the other year. If you look at some of the legislation that's been proposed, the ability of this Mayor and indeed other mayors to implement policies like that and to innovate and to mitigate against some of perhaps the negative impacts about what the government is proposing will be much more constrained. And I think as the GLA, we are doing a lot of work to look at how we can see this legislation amended and changed to take some of that out. But I am very, very worried that there might now start to be a bit of a direction of travel away from devolution, which will then in turn limit the ability of the Mayor and of City Hall to help the people that we know need help the most.
Thank you, Tom. We'll take a short question from Assembly Member Devonish and then back to Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. The Deputy Mayor spoken for 10 minutes. He hasn't actually said anything at all which is actually factual yet. I actually was at a lot of the now Prime Minister's hustings during the summer. She made it very clear, Deputy Mayor, on numerous occasions the levelling up agenda remains, and a lot of the things you've said are just basically things for journalists to speculate on. I'm disappointed the first meeting we have after Her Majesty's service, when we're going back to real politics, I thought you'd be talking about how you're looking forward to engaging with the new government and the new Secretary of State, rather than coming up a whole load of comments which there's no facts at all in what you've said for 10 minutes, and I'm rather disappointed because the reality is the level up agenda remains. She's made it very, very crystal clear, and I can give you chapter and verse if you like outside the meeting.
Has she explained what it is yet? Because it has eluded people. I mean, Michael Gove had a good go at it, and I have to say, I never thought I would ever say this, but I miss Michael Gove.
I'll make sure I pass on his best wishes. Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor.
He might be watching. Thank you. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you very much, Chair. And my question is to Tom. Assuming that we are going ahead with the levelling up agenda, and obviously we're very lucky to have Assembly Member Devonish, who's able to assure us of the government's direction of travel on these matters. So he's obviously very tied into the government, although he's actually not part of it, I notice. One of the missions for the levelling up agenda is for the number of non-decent rented homes to have fallen by 50% by 2030. So that's in just over 8 years. With the biggest improvements in the lowest performing areas. How achievable is this for London? And you can do that in the context of going ahead with the reforms and bringing the DRS to the DHS to the PRS, or not, or both.
I mean, we support, and I support, the Mayor supports the extension of decent homes into the private rented sector, of course. It's vital that no matter what sector you live in, you can have a decent home. What I would say about it, though, is it can't just be about revisiting the 2006 standards, which, of course, are very, very out of date now. They have to be standards that are right and appropriate for the current time. And that means, of course, they must address things like sustainability and energy efficiency and things like that to ensure that they're going to meet the very great challenges that we face currently. There's a question about how it would be paid for.
So just before you move on to that,
yeah.
Can I just ask you what you're referring to? Because obviously in the 2006 standard, there are, it includes thermal comfort, and so many people use this as an opportunity to do an awful lot of window replacement programs and a lot of loft insulation and indeed cavity wall insulation to improve the thermal comfort of buildings, and then also introduced TRVs, thermostatic radiator valves, so that people could control the heating individually in rooms. And so there's been a number of big programs that have addressed particularly controls around energy. What were you thinking of that needs to be improved on top of that?
Well, I think now, we're moving on to things like, solid wall insulation and stuff like that, which much more becoming much more common now. But I just think that as part of what the government is proposing to do on this, and in terms of the consultation, they need to be looking broadly at what a decent home in 2022 means. And the Mayor will be responding to the consultation.
So would you see something similar to the social housing decarbonisation fund as being appropriate here for the private rental sector? Because if you're talking about insulation of solid walls, that's either external or internal wall insulation, and that's quite expensive.
I was just going to come on to the point of how this is paid for, because obviously landlords need to be putting their hands in their pockets for this. They are the property owners. They benefit, of course, from investment into those properties in terms of greater thermal efficiency. Their values will go up. But I do think there is very broadly a very strong argument for more funding from the government to support people to bring their homes up to much higher energy efficiency standards, given the challenges that we have in terms of moving towards net zero.
So you would see this as being some sort of joint fund. I don't like to mention Grenfell, but that sort of, expecting landlords to put some of the money in, but also expecting the government to come forward with some funding
I just
as well?
think in principle, and as I say, we'll be responding to the consultation, but I think there's an important principle that the property owner needs to put their hand in their pocket. But I think, support from the government across the board for these kinds of measures is extremely wanting. And if we're going to hit let alone the Mayor's target, but the government's own target on net zero, there's going to need to be a step change in terms of support for people to bring their homes up to a decent thermal standard. I was struck by, I'm sure you've seen that graph that goes around, which is, I think it includes cavity wall insulation, loft insulation, things like that. And you get to 2012, I think, and then it plummets in terms of the number of homes that have been...
Yes, I believe that's when the ADP and the money that was carried forward from the Labour government that ended in 2010 fell away.
I couldn't possibly comment on that, Assembly Member Cooper, but I think you might be right. And I just think, you know, if that level of investment had been carried on up to now, think of the number of people who wouldn't be, you know, facing extremely hard choices this winter in terms of, you know, heating or eating and things like that. You know, if that investment had been carried on, we would be in a far better place than we are now. What do they say? The best time to do something is 10 years ago. The second best time to do something is today. So.
Can I just ask you one final point? And I do know that graph, and it's very depressing to see that the number of homes improved did just fall off a cliff in 2012. Which is, do you think there's any locus for occupants, whether tenants or leaseholders, to be expected to contribute as well?
I think the principle is it's the landlord is the person that should be paying. I mean, we've been very clear in terms of, you know, building safety, for example. You know, leaseholders shouldn't be out of pocket. However, it might be that the leaseholder wishes to access the fund themselves and may wish to do that. And tenants, of course, shouldn't be paying. Absolutely not.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Boff.
Sorry about that.
I can hear you now.
Yeah. To Dr. Minton, the government has released their white paper on renters' reforms and the consultation on the decent home standard for the private rented sector. What do you expect the impact of these reforms will be for London?
Can I make any points about convergence before I come on to private renting? Because there was something... Sorry, I meant levelling up.
Yes, no, absolutely.
There was something I wanted to add to the levelling up debate, which you can probably imagine from what I just said, relates to the idea of convergence. And I just wanted to highlight that levelling up isn't really a new idea. And in fact, as far as I can see, it's pretty much identical to the idea of convergence, which we saw around the 2012 Olympics, the idea of the 4 Olympic boroughs, well, effectively levelling up to the rest of the city. And what I would say about that aspiration, whatever one may think about that direction of travel, about which I'm quite sceptical, a levelling up approach. Nonetheless, as some of you probably know, the London Assembly has taken it forward through what they renamed the growth boroughs, and it's part of the London Plan, and there are a number of targets included in that. And I think within the big picture, there is actually quite a lot that can be done with specific targets, and, you know, change can be leveraged at a sort of more micro level. So I just wanted to point out that if the levelling up agenda is indeed continuing, it's not a new agenda, and actually you already have some of the tools which you've put in place with regards to convergence, and this might be a good time to revisit that and take that further forward in the light of levelling up.
Could you just expand a little for me why you're sceptical about convergence, or
Sure.
So I want to get your words right.
Yeah, I mean, I think big picture, I'm sceptical because I see it as being based on, well, this is my viewpoint. I see it based on a sort of trickle down economics idea. Levering in lots of private finance into an area, as the Olympics did, are likely to trickle down to the surrounding boroughs. Rising tide lifts all boats, and my view would be, there's been some discussion over this approach recently, nationally and globally, as I'm sure you know. My view would be that this doesn't really work, big picture, but actually the micro picture is that there are things that can be done, and the London Assembly has already shown that it has focused on, you know, specific targets and specific areas, and, you know, I think around the margins, progress can be achieved to those ends. Nice
to hear that scepticism reflected, because I think that's been a criticism of the Olympic project.
Well, indeed.
For many years. Can we just go back to the Decent Home Standard
Sure.
consultation? Are they going to have an impact on London, do you think?
I mean, if it's taken forward, it will depend how it's taken forward, of course. Sorry, was this to me?
No, it wasn't.
Oh, sorry.
But
I thought you were looking
always,
at me.
always pleased to hear your
so
dulcet
sorry. I'm
tones.
so sorry.
But actually,
You should be a
it's to
politician.
Dr. Minton.
I suppose, again, I have some scepticism, well, first of all, about how, a number of the levelling up priorities will be taken forward. And then, especially where, in such a resource-constrained environment, I'm not sure that this would be seen as a priority, quite frankly.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. My apologies, Assembly Member Berry. Skipped you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Can I start with just another bit of clarification on the idea of convergence that was just brought up? This isn't my original question, but I asked the Mayor about this in February because one of the things that the convergence agenda did was set a number of targets in terms of actual outcomes, including overcrowding. And the committee as a whole is very interested in overcrowding. And they stopped reporting on that in 2016. So I asked the Mayor in an MQ 0512 this year, are you going to use the census this year to really see if the convergence goals were met? And he said no, not in terms of overcrowding, and also gave me some numbers which were all about the delivery of numbers of homes, which isn't really an outcome if those homes are not affordable to Londoners. So I was quite disappointed with that because we'll never, like you say, you've got some criticisms of convergence, Dr. Minton, but we'll not be able to evidence that because there is no monitoring of that going on anymore, and that's, I think, quite disappointing.
Would you like me to?
I was just giving a point of information, but if you would like to comment, that would be really useful. And also, I imagine the Deputy Mayor was responsible for that answer. So,
I mean, all I would say is that I think there is some potential here to set targets and monitor them carefully. But if they're set and then not monitored, obviously that is entirely pointless. So the framework, may well allow you to re-energise this approach.
Did you want a response from me on this one?
yeah, I mean, just, in terms of levelling up and the government's agenda, if they're not setting appropriate targets that actually do result in resources going to the right place and the right sort of outcomes coming for people
Yes.
across the UK, if it's just numbers of homes built in different places, they're not really going to be doing anything very worthwhile, are they? So
No.
I just wondered, are you doing anything to put together evidence for a genuine levelling up agenda like you've sort of outlined?
Well, there is actually one target as part of the Levelling Up white paper, which is that by 2030 renters will have a secure path to ownership, and the number of non-decent rented homes will have fallen by 50%. So there is some targets in there. I think the key thing, though, in terms of actually getting the delivery we need, is devolution. What really frustrates me is that, this is supposedly all about, levelling up the nation and, particularly, we suspect poorer parts of the north, and there's absolutely, that's absolutely what we would all want, so long as that's, not a zero-sum game where poorer parts of London end up losing out. But it's also centralised. You have to bid in to DLUC. The hand of the Treasury is all over everything. And I think, really, if levelling up is going to be successful, or convergence is going to be successful, you've got to trust local areas and regions and city regions to be able to know and decide what are the priorities in their area, give them the funding to actually make an impact. I think that's how we will get results in terms of levelling up. Not this very, typically, I have to say, the Treasury is very reluctant to spend money and to give money and give power away to the regions, and that's actually been the case, for a long time. But I think if you are going to succeed, that's what you need to do.
Okay, that leads nicely into the question I intended to make. So yeah, in terms of devolution, we are the region with the most devolution already, and one of the powers we have is the power to set our own housing strategy and to get more flexibility in terms of how we use our housing grants and that sort of thing. And I know that I've talked to the mayor about this. The housing strategy that we have is from 2018 and is somewhat out of date now. There's a lot of things that we are actually doing at a London level and things we're focusing on that are now, they're not really reflected in there. Things like recognising overcrowding as a bad thing in its own right. The green agenda's obviously moved on somewhat in terms of things like demolition. And I think it doesn't have anything in it at all about the potential benefits that we're starting to demonstrate of acquiring and buying new social homes, not just building them. Those are all things that you could put into using your own powers that you currently have, put into a refreshed housing strategy, which would be a strong evidence base for more devolution, and other regions could then make use of that methodology as well. What do you think of doing that? Because the mayor was quite dismissive and said it was basically fine.
But I don't think at this stage we do need to renew it. In fact, we're doing a lot of that stuff that you just set out under the current housing strategy, of course. You know, the last point you made...
With the tiniest little hooks is what
social housing acquisitions rather than the new builds, with the caveat that new build is absolutely the priority. We're doing that under the mayor's right to buy back programme. If we had a bigger pot of money, we could and would do a lot more. But I think you say it's small. It is. I think we are doing the most that we can with the resources that we've got, and we're doing it under the mayor's current housing strategy. I'm very happy to have a discussion with you to hear what you think. I mean, you set some of them out already, but any of the other merits that you think would come from that renewal. But I've not heard anything that tells me that we need to be updating and publishing a new strategy at this time.
Okay, I mean, that's fair enough, and I'll keep pressing for it. There's definitely a case, though, to make to government, the case for new funding streams, new targets to be set for different regions, as well as London. If they're led by London's evidence base, that puts us in a position of strength, does it not?
Yeah, and I tell you, we are constantly pushing the government for more funding. It's absolutely vital and absolutely necessary. There's been a 21% increase in materials costs in the last year. There have been, we've had the building safety crisis, we've had the war in Ukraine, we've got inflation now, running at an incredibly high rate. We've had Brexit, of course. All of which have contributed to a very difficult environment. And yet, on the 2016 to 23 programme, we're still working with the same pot of money that was agreed before all of this happened in 2016. So, believe me, extra funding and lobbying the government for extra funding is a priority.
Thank you. Assembly Member Devenish, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hold up my glass of water and ask the Deputy Mayor if that's half empty or half full. I think it's half full. We should be positive.
I'm a bit too far away to actually see how much water.
I thought you were going to blame the government, Tom, for a second.
As far as I can see, it could be full or empty.
Right. All I'm going to ask, if you can actually answer this question positively about what you're doing as the Deputy Mayor and the Mayor's team is doing, rather than just going on about the government all the time. So my question... That
is the topic of the session. But,
well, yes, but it's also about what you are doing as well, Deputy Mayor. So my question is to you first, and then I'll come on to Anna, if I could, please. So the government has this year released the White Paper on Renters Reform and the Consultation on Decent Home Standard, as we all know, for the private rental sector. So my question to you, please, Deputy Mayor, is what do you expect the impact of these reforms will be for London, and how are you preparing to Sorry, am I reading the last question? Apologies. Apologies. I am. Apologies. I am cracking up. It's the one I highlighted. So my question, I'll start again, apologies. There are reports of some significant decreases in the availability of homes in the private rented sector in London over the past year, resulting in increased competition and rising prices for tenants. What is your assessment of why this is happening, please? Did you see the Berkeley Homes announcement only last week that the chief executive there says that the number of homes in London has halved overall since 2015, and he believes is probably going to halve again? And will the reforms have any further effect on the availability of PRS homes in London, please?
Well, first of all, we're very concerned about the drop in the number of available homes in the private rented sector. I think there are a few things that could be cited as reasons for this. Of course, we had the big influx of people coming back to London post-pandemic. I think there's also been a kind of snowball effect of people seeing rents going up and therefore deciding to remain in their properties, and therefore fewer properties being available to let. Some people cite the George Osborne tax changes in 2016, but you know that was quite some time ago now. Interestingly, I saw some research, and I now can't remember, I think it was Rightmove, which was a survey of landlords, which found that most of them were planning to increase the size of their portfolio over the next years. It's very difficult to know actually what's going on, which is why we're looking at some research to actually go out and try and ascertain what the reasons are for the reduction, and so that we have a clearer picture of what's going on.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by your going out with some research, please?
Our policy team will be doing some research.
Okay. And Anna?
Yeah, I mean, my view on that would be that the key factor is soaring inflation, property price inflation, which means that, and has meant for a long time, that really very, very few people under the age of 45 are able to buy their own homes. So they are all in the private rented sector. At the same time, you've also got the huge pressure on the private rented sector from the ever diminishing pool of social housing. So a third of tenants in social housing are renting privately as well. So you've got those two pressures coming in at the same time. But yeah, essentially it's property price inflation. There's not enough affordable, and by which I mean genuinely affordable housing. And we might want to come back to that question of genuinely affordable housing at some point this morning.
Thank you. And Deputy Mayor, what exactly are the GLA plans to support the thousands of Londoners who are struggling more than ever before to access private rental sector housing, please?
Well, obviously, we continue to lobby the government for the measures under the Mayor's London model and in the Renters Reform Bill. The Mayor, of course, has no actual power over the private rented sector in London, but despite that, is doing what he can to help. We've got the property licence and agent checker and the rogue landlord, the property licence checker and the rogue landlord and agent checker, which were established by the Mayor, despite him having no powers over the private rented sector in London. But I agree with Anna, you can't get away from the fact that if we're going to make a real difference, we need to be building a lot more social and council housing. We're doing what we can with the money that we've got in very choppy waters. But again, the thing that we really need is this greater supply of social and council housing, because there are a lot of people that we know are living in the private rented sector who historically would have lived in social housing, but they can't anymore because there isn't enough social housing.
My next question, Deputy Mayor. Some of the government's proposals will mean new responsibilities for local authorities. Do local authorities have the capacity to deliver on new responsibilities, and what specifically can the GLA do to support them? I think that what we need is, should this legislation come to pass,
and I really hope it will, it must come with additional funding streams for local councils. I don't think you can get away from that. You know, if you're going to place new burdens on local authorities, I remember the case, you know, with the Homelessness Reduction Act when that came in. I think a lot of councils were very concerned that there wasn't funding attached or enough funding attached for them actually to carry out their new responsibilities. I think the same concern probably exists about this. I think most local councils are up for this. They think it's really important. They think it's going to benefit their local communities. But I do think that it has to come with funding attached, and that funding has to come from the government. The GLA doesn't have funding streams certainly not at the level that would be required for us to be able to pay to support this.
So you can't do anything apart from ask for more money. How well do local authorities use their current private sector enforcement powers, such as the housing, health and safety risk rating system, and what role would they have in setting and enforcing the new decent home standard for private rented homes, and what needs to happen to ensure this role is successful?
I think it really varies from borough to borough. As we know, some boroughs in London have licensing schemes, but the presence of a licensing scheme itself doesn't necessarily mean the licensing scheme is effective. There are effective licensing schemes and non-effective ones. I think the most successful councils, the ones with licensing schemes, are the ones that proactively go out and inspect every property when it goes onto the register and when the landlord gets their licence. That varies across the different schemes. I think that, you know, the most effective ones are the ones that go out, do that proactive inspection at the moment the landlord gets the licence.
And my final...
Just very quickly, I think Assembly Member Cooper wanted to come in before you take the next question.
Thanks. I want to go back to the previous question. And I wanted to ask Anna Minton, obviously the private rented sector is quite varied. It varies from landlords that own, you know, multiple properties in many number, down to a quite sizable proportion of individuals who in recent years decided that because of fluctuations in the stock market that putting your money into a pension scheme was a mistake, and have actually in many cases put money into just one property or maybe two, or a very, very small number anyway. What's your perception in terms of, do you have any figures for the people who've been coming out of the private renter sector? Because there has been this significant decrease in the number of private renter sector properties available. Is that the smaller individual landlords coming out, or is there sales or just people coming out of the private renter sector from the larger landlords who own multiple properties? Do you have a feel for that?
I wouldn't have any figures for that, and I mean, I'm interested actually to hear you say, you know, that you're aware that there's been a significant sort of decrease in the size of the buy-to-let landlord market. Actually, I'd be interested to know how significant that decrease is.
Well, just significant decrease in the number of private renter sector properties available altogether, and I'm wondering which part of the private renter sector it might be, and I'm asking you if it could be the sort of buy-to-let.
I mean, I think my perception really is that it's more a sort of question of a sort of silting up of the market, you know, not exactly paralysis, but, you know, just the market isn't moving, and the market isn't moving because house price inflation is just so high that's just inhibiting people from moving around. It's inhibiting people from buying new properties. So there are just so many people chasing after, you know, perhaps a slightly reduced, as I say, I don't know those figures about the market decreasing, but, you know, my perception is that it's really much more about demand than it is about supply, actually.
So you don't think the changes that the government made for private sector landlords, for example, people, you know, obviously pay a mortgage, a buy-to-let mortgage in many cases, let's say they're paying £500 a month, used to be able to offset that against the income, and they're now having to pay tax on the £500 that they actually don't get because they're giving it to their mortgage company. Do you think that might have had an impact?
It may well have had an impact. I mean, I think what would be really interesting is if we could get some data on that.
Do you think Arla might be able to help here, the Association of Residential Landlords, someone like that? Do you have any thoughts about who we could get
I think it would. I think it's a good question, and I think it's worth asking. But I don't think it's the main question. You know, I don't think that these tax changes actually are nearly as important as us having, you know, some of the highest rates of inflation in the world.
I mean, we have been, you know, looking at the fact that there is a significant decrease. I'm going to come on to Tom now. Thanks very much, Anna. A significant decrease at the same time as there's been an increase in reliance on the private renter sector by councils to discharge their homelessness responsibilities, and you know, obviously a lot of people who've been unable to get on the housing ladder because their income is nowhere near the property values. Do you think that combination of the decrease in supply along with the increase in demand, I mean, Anna's saying she thinks it's more around the increase in demand, but surely having a significant decrease in private renter sector properties is going to drive rents even higher and is going to make things even more difficult. Do you have any figures for who's coming out?
As far as I'm aware, the decrease is in the number of rented properties becoming available to let. I haven't actually seen data, and it may be that I've just missed it. I haven't actually seen any data. I think this is why the research that our policy team are going to do is so important, and whether the actual total number of private rented sector homes in London has gone down. There's certainly been a decrease in the number coming onto the market, as it were. But as I said earlier, that could be because sitting tenants are deciding to remain in the properties for longer because they're worried about rising rents, you know, if they move somewhere else. So I don't quite think we've got the information that we need to make a sort of accurate assessment at the moment.
Right.
But I fully intend to get that.
To dig into this with your survey that you were just talking about.
I think we'd be looking at the available data out there, and then, you know, if there isn't available data, what we could do in terms of finding some data, because, you know, it's a really important question. You know, I know people who live in the private rented sector who've been moving recently, and it's been an absolute nightmare.
And just to come back to the point that Assemblymember Devonish was making about the use of the housing health and safety rating system, and have councils been appropriately enforcing via environmental health officers, do you not think until we get rid of Section 21 that there's actually going to be a problem with tenants in the private renter sector actually coming forward to go and talk to a council because they will fear to be evicted rather than actually report that they've got significant disrepair problems?
Absolutely. This has been the case for a long time, but I think particularly in a very tight market, which is, you know, very much pro landlord, you know, in favour of the landlord and against the tenant in terms of landlords having a lot more choice. I think it will only get worse because landlords will think, you know what, I can definitely get a new tenant, and I can probably get a higher rent at the same time.
Yeah, you took the follow-on from my question very accurately, which is obviously if you get rid of that person through a Section 21, you just bring in somebody else who will possibly pay more and still have to suffer the same level of disrepair.
Exactly. We're in exactly the opposite market of where we were during COVID in London, where, you know, it was very much the tenants' market. Of course, interestingly, if we'd had no fault eviction back then, we might now have a lot of tenants being able to stay in properties at much lower rents rather than being kicked out when the market gets hot, because landlords, you know, understandably want to get a higher rent.
Yes, well, not necessarily. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. If I can go back to Assemblymember Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got one last question, and I'm sure this one the Deputy Mayor will even be able to welcome it, hopefully. What will be the impact of the single Ombudsman for the private rental sector, and how will this, in your view, help it improve standards?
Well, I think having a mechanism for redress for private tenants can only be a good thing, is what I would say on that, Tony. Sorry, Assembly Member Devonish. Sorry? Yeah, I'm going to delight you, Tony. I'm going to say I welcome this. I was saying some positive things earlier about the Rented Reform Bill.
Yeah, I'm now a happy person.
That is a wonderful way to move on to Assemblymember Boff. Made you happy.
What is the Mayor doing to encourage more people to come forward and offer properties up on the PRS sector, private rental sector?
That's an interesting question, Assembly Member Boff. I think through the Mayor's planning policies on build to rent, that's certainly having an impact, a positive impact on the number of private rented sector properties coming forward. We've got planning policy within the London plan, a whole section on build to rent. And just anecdotally, you know, when we go through the referable planning applications, we do get a lot of build to rent schemes coming through. And of course, build to rent, you know, since the 60s, I think, or the 70s, build to rent hasn't really been a sort of major part of the London or the UK housing market, and now it's becoming a major part.
It's not so much. I mean, planning is not your brief; it's housing. What are you doing therefore to encourage more privately rented?
I think on this one, there's, you know, I do have some responsibility for the planning policies that specifically relate to housing. Hence, the second part of my title, which I don't always use, which is Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development.
So, amongst the, this is great to talk about the future because that's what the planning planning talks about. What I'm talking about is what you're doing now to encourage those people who have properties who may wish to open them up for. To be privately rented. I mean, nothing is an okay reply.
I don't think that one is. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I'd happily take some suggestions, but I'm not sure.
So you're
what exactly what that would entail. I mean, you know.
Well, I'm asking the question. You're saying you aren't doing it.
The one of the big levers the mayor has is his planning powers. He's using those planning powers to actually increase the supply of housing, where, of course, a buy-to-let property, of course, that just changes a property from owner-occupied over to private rented. Doesn't increase the overall supply of housing.
That's a lot of answers to questions I didn't ask. So what is the Mayor currently... I mean, I'm gathering from what you've said is that the Mayor isn't doing anything to encourage people to offer their homes up as private rentals.
Well, I'm not sure what the Mayor could do in that regard. You know,
he isn't doing anything.
I'm not sure what the Mayor could do in that regard.
Okay. Very good. So he's not.
But
doing
I'll take
anything.
Suggestions if you want to send them via email.
Dr. Minton, you wanted to indicate this.
Yeah, it's just interesting that we're having this discussion, and I think there's a piece in The Guardian this morning talking about Westminster Council's proposals to open up the empty homes of oligarchs for affordable housing. Brilliant. So, I mean, I think, you know, if Westminster Council can start to look at that sort of approach, you know, it would be nice to think that the Mayor would be able to encourage that sort of approach across the city.
You've reminded me something I'd forgotten about, which is that earlier in the year, just after the invasion of Ukraine, the Mayor did call for the expropriation of oligarch properties to be used for homeless families. So there you go.
But it certainly does. I mean, it doesn't have to be just oligarch properties. You know, I mean, there's a huge number of empty homes in London.
Thank you very much. There's calling for things and doing things, and there's a difference between the two. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Boff. I have a question from Assemblymember Berry. I'm conscious that you have sat here for a little while. I promise we will get to you in the next section. But if
I
you
have
did
got
have anything...
a comment on the last ones,
Sure.
if that's possible as well.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I suppose one of the things that we are increasingly seeing is that local housing allowance rates. They don't cover rents in many parts of London, and we're seeing many people being unable to stay in those parts of London. So I think, you know, part of the debate has to also be about uprating that, seeing as we've had such high inflation within the private rental sector. And I think the other thing I just wanted to say is that we actually started having a very good debate about regeneration again when we were talking about levelling up and how we can have better regeneration in London. To, you know, that's one way of getting, you know, better quality homes, but also more social homes and more social rented homes in that. So those are a couple of points I wanted to make about, you know, not losing that debate, because that is equally important in different parts of the country where, you know, property levels are low. And it's more important to improve the quality of the homes, as well as in London, where obviously property values are high. And, you know, what we do see is that once you take into account housing costs, you know, what it costs people to live in London, then, you know, the average rent is, the average income is the same as the rest of the country. So it's really, you know, important that we don't lose sight of those proposals that were being discussed.
Thank you. Assembly Member Berry. Thank you, Geeta.
Thank you very much. I was surprised. I know it's mainly led by London councils and local authorities, but I was surprised Deputy Mayor didn't want to mention the capital letters scheme in answer to the previous question from Assembly Member Bob.
Yes,
I would
we
like
do
to
support
invite you to talk about that, if that's okay.
Thank you for that assistance, Assembly Member Berry. Yes, the Mayor does support the capital letters scheme. He supported it financially. This is, of course, about councils coming together, supporting an organisation which acquires properties for people who need temporary accommodation, thus reducing local authorities' reliance on nightly paid accommodation. So, yes, thank you for the opportunity to highlight that one.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to move on. We can ask the Deputy Mayor for units for capital letters.
Off the top of my head, I don't know. Although I'm sure I did see a response to a written Mayor's question that had this information in it. It might even have been from you, Assembly Member Devonish. But the information is out there, and I'm sure we can acquire it for you.
That would be great. If I could, before we come to you, Dr. Minton, you had said earlier that you wanted to say a little bit more about genuinely affordable housing. I don't know if you had said all you wanted to say.
Well, I mean, just really to sort of reiterate, I'm sure it's an issue that the whole of the committee is aware of, but, you know, the difficulties with definition, you know, are at the heart of public discourse about this. And while, you know, I'm expecting everyone in the room to know that the definitions of affordable housing are up to 80% of market value, you know, when it's reported, a lot of people don't know that, and they presume affordable housing is affordable housing, and obviously up to 80% of market value in London, that isn't affordable for the vast majority of Londoners. And then all the sort of gradations within the category of affordable housing, whether it's shared ownership or whether it's rent to buy or whatever it might be. You know, there are so many different categories. It's really difficult, I think, for people to understand this topic. So, you know, I think we have to be very clear when we discuss it, whether we're talking about affordable housing or whether we're talking about social housing. And if we're talking about social housing, at what percentage of people's income that is put at. And actually, you know, according to studies, you should not be paying more than 30% of your monthly income on your housing costs, or there are deleterious effects to your mental health. So I just think we have to be really clear about what affordable housing is, perhaps not use the term anymore because it's become meaningless.
Thank you, Dr. Minton. Assembly Member Boff.
This is to Ms. Nanda. Have the government, you kind of touched on this on your earlier intervention, but have the government's proposals been welcomed by the housing association sector? And are the changes deliverable?
Are you talking specifically about the private rental or more broadly?
Social housing reform, I'm sorry, but we didn't.
Oh, okay, social.
I beg your pardon, we didn't do a sort of an announcement that we've moved on to the next section. Social housing reform.
Okay, social housing
Thank
reform,
you.
yeah. We do really welcome the social housing regulation bill, and actually we were urging the government to bring it forward, and we're very positive really about the measures as well, the tenant satisfaction measures that will be coming out about that. It's really important that residents have a voice and they are listened to. and that there are mechanisms by which we do that. So we think it is absolutely right that these reforms are coming through, and we fully support it.
Would you like to have seen any more? I mean, first of all, do you think those reforms are actually deliverable?
Yes,
bearing in mind there's a lot of requirements.
I think the reforms are deliverable. I think a lot of it has to be further, so it's individual organisations who are taking some of those headings and doing more with them, because it can't all be stipulated in a bill. This is around culture and purpose of organisations in order to deliver the right services for residents.
Were there other actions you would like to have seen in these proposals?
I think that there is more to come out. So the consultations are sort of ongoing and are being delivered. So we have put sort of responses to those consultations. I think a lot of it will look at how the regulation regime develops as a result of it, and making sure those standards that exist are applied within organisations. So I think that bit has yet to develop.
You've responded on behalf of G15, have you?
That's right, yeah.
And what kind of suggestions have they had, additional measures?
I mean, what we've said is that we fully support it, and we will work with the regulator to make sure those standards that are in place are fully developed. So that they can be applicable and apply to our residents. So
there's no gaping holes in there of policies that you would have liked to have seen adopted?
No, we think it's something which will emerge as the standards are applied.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think it may be impacting.
Is it about the number of people who are allowed to speak at the same time? I am now allowed. I have a further question about further questions about social housing reforms, Geeta. So you've talked about the proposals around engagement with tenants. Obviously, one of the advantages there should be for housing associations is the engagement with tenants and tenants to have a voice and everything like that. But what do you see as the reasons why the housing association sector has got to a point where those reforms, those recommendations and that perception of a lack of engagement has got out? How did we get here, do you think?
I think many organisations have and have had mechanisms by which they're engaging with residents. And I think some of the proposals which are taking it to more of a national level, so there is a tenants panel, there is a broader tenants voice that can feed in is really important. I suppose there's no, there has been a focus on delivery of new homes. And I think the focus which is back on existing residents is very important. The investment in people's homes is really important as well. So, I think this all ties in. We had a number of years of rent decreases. We've got the rent cap discussion, which is coming about now. So it's really important that there is the finances to deliver on those standards and promises that we make for our residents as well. But I think, engagements, people have different ways of doing it in different organisations, but making sure that there is consumer standards which are monitored and regulated, it makes sure that discussion is very much at the top of every organisation's board and committee.
Yeah. So you're saying you think that the housing associations generally are engaging, but you do also think the reforms are necessary. Which one is it? Do you think this is something that needs to be addressed, or do you think housing associations are generally doing it?
I think housing associations, I don't know any housing association that doesn't have mechanisms by which they do talk to their residents. I think the regulation and the oversight of those standards hasn't been there. I think it's really important that individual organisations are doing it, and they're making sure that the mechanisms are having a difference. There's no point talking to people if it doesn't lead to any change. And I think the regulatory reform and making sure those standards are part of it, will ensure that people have that, outcome. It's more outcome focused.
Absolutely agree, because of course mechanisms is not the same as people feeling engaged and feeling that control and voice. So how do you feel that a regulator, which presumably, will be looking at the mechanisms and looking where the mechanisms in place and not necessarily outcomes, or do you feel that they will be able to look at those outcomes and really measure the quality of the interaction, rather than the fact that there is a body or that a survey goes out, or whatever those measures are?
I think boards, it's individual organisations, executive and boards that are responsible for making sure that that however you engage with your residents needs to change and needs to positive outcomes for the organisation. So it is boards' responsibilities, but I think the regulator can ensure that those discussions are being had and that is being seen to make that difference.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm doing this. Yes, Tom. I was actually about to ask you a question before I came back to Geeta. Do you want to come in and then I'll check that you've...
I'll ask and I'll add my bit on.
Okay. Right, yeah. I was going to ask you how you feel about the similarly about engagement, council's engagement with their tenants in council homes.
Thank you. I think across the social housing sector, both housing associations and councils, we've recently, seen some really egregious examples of poor management and poor standards, and a lot of this has been highlighted by housing campaigner Courageous to Emboa. Some really, really heartrending stuff. I think it's true to say that the vast majority, I think this is borne out in the evidence that we got, the vast majority of properties are of a good standard and a decent standard, and in fact the social housing sector, I think, has the highest compliance with a decent home standard of any sector. In terms of engagement, I think there's a variation, of course, between different local authorities. I think some do it very well, some do it less well. But it is important that tenants' voices are heard. Mm-hmm. And if I may just add on the social housing regulation bill, I'm glass half full. Tony's gone, unfortunately. But I think there's a lot of good stuff in there. Just even with engagement, you still have to have a regulatory regime that is effective. I would add that a lot of this recreates what was abolished in 2010 by the coalition government, like the Tenant Services Authority, but it's still a good piece of legislation. One thing certainly that the Mayor would like to see that isn't in there is a commissioner for social housing tenants who would be a social housing tenant and who would sit on the regulator's board to ensure that tenants' voices are heard.
Okay, thank you. Just to come back to Geeta, how is it currently measured? So we're going back to the same subject. The second question is about how your members, G15 members, would measure the level of trust or a level of engagement that tenants have in the housing association. Is there mechanisms to do that? And do you think government's reforms will increase that overall, that level of trust?
Yeah, so I think in the new measures, the tenant satisfaction measures that are being announced, there is something around trust, but there's also a piece of work which the National Housing Federation is doing, a commission which is supported by G15, which is really around quality and trust. So it's going out extensively to talk to different organisations, different residents and groups, etc., around what does that mean and how can that be rebuilt in many cases with housing associations. So I think, one of the things is we want to look at the outcome of that, because I think this is an independent piece of work which is really, shining a light and we should look at the outcomes of that. But I think a lot of it is also very local level. So, often, so for an example, on one of our estates, we did, listening exercises with the residents, then, you know, what do we need to do to bring different stakeholders together to change the outcomes that they want, and how do we measure that works? And that then at a very local level gives you, you know, more trust that there is something that is being done and things that are being heard. So I think, you know, you can do a lot which is at a very, you know, top level, but actually it is really being local and understanding what those really local concerns are in different areas or different estates. So, you know, it has to come from the top, but it also has to come from the bottom as well.
Totally agree. It's that control over their local environment, a lot of the case that
and
that
we
matters.
actually had Kwajo over at a G15 meeting, and I've met him a couple of times, and you know, he's done an amazing job. Was one individual to really to raise a profile and push it up the agenda, and have conversations about why these things are happening and what needs to change. We had a very good discussion around skills as well. You know, how we need more plumbers, more electricians, more, you know, there are kind of, you know, there's the big picture stuff, and then there's the individual, why does this happen in one particular area? So I think, you know, from that is we need to have some of those broader conversations as well. That's why it's very hard to have, you know, we don't have a lot of the skills, and they're being leaked out of London because of living costs, etc. And we need to do more apprenticeships, more skills to keep those key jobs in London as well. So, you know, I think that's all part of the broader debate as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's sort of, we've slightly abstractly separated off the actual standards, quality of homes to engagement and trust. Of course, they're so closely linked. And so just to ask, do you have an understanding of which parts of your housing stock do not meet the decent home standard?
Yeah, we're very aware of which properties don't meet the decent home standard, why they don't meet it, what needs to be done to do that. Also, there was a discussion earlier around you know, the private rented sector and green initiatives. And, you know, we've been very successful in terms of bidding to BAYS, but it's, you know, the next wave of that funding is 50-50. We hope that funding carries on because it's been instrumental in us being able to bring a lot of homes up from a D to a C or a C to a B level. So, you know, I think there is the decent homes, but then there's the environmental efficiency of those homes as well. You know, and it is incredibly complicated. So just as the way what is an affordable home is questioned, what is a decent home, when you have, you know, all these incredibly complex criteria which you can move around and say it's a decent home, may not feel decent to that resident. Which is why it comes back to the engagement as well, so they actually can have control over what their standards are. And do you have a sense of, I mean, you've mentioned some other barriers as well about in terms of skills and actually being able to get the people to do the work, but do you have a sense about how much it costs to bring all those homes up to a decent standard? Yeah, I haven't got a figure on me, but we have that in our plan. The key question now is how we pay for that.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned before, you mentioned earlier on the sort of competing demands on housing associations in terms of the priority of making sure that tenants have decent homes versus further delivery. Presumably that's going to be a continued pressure, even though now there's an additional emphasis on making sure tenants have the decent homes, existing tenants. And so what impact will those costs have, or that different priority, on new homes? Sorry, that was a very long way. How are you going to manage those competing demands? Or is it all about just you need more finances?
At the moment, it's a discussion that every organisation is having, because there is decarbonisation, there's decent homes, there's investment in those homes, there's building new homes. There's the energy cap announcement today, but you know there's been a huge increase in our costs just in 1 year as an association, which we've had to find rapidly because of sheltered schemes, care homes, communal areas where we've had a large increase in terms of energy costs, which we're absorbing as an organisation. And then there was the the building safety standards. Absolutely, we agreed that leaseholders and tenants shouldn't pay, but as landlords we are paying, and you know that is all impacting on our finances. So the model of building new homes, it's under extreme stress, and there have been big reductions in the number of homes people are able to build. But even so, there's a sort of 3-year cycle of building homes, and we've got tomorrow, we've got next year, we've got existing commitments that we want to make, but it's getting very difficult to balance these different priorities, and some things will have to go.
Yeah, I was just about to say something's going to give, but it sounds a bit like everything might do a little bit, rather than being able to go, okay, we're not going to prioritise that. You're going to continue to be asked to prioritise everything and sort of do everything not quite as well as you're being asked to or would like to.
Well, I think, the costs of borrowing are going up. The ratings agencies are looking at those large housing associations such as ourselves and others around being able to borrow, and what rating you have, and whether the shifts and changes to the rent standard will have a blanket change to how housing associations are assessed. So at the moment, it's all up in flux, and we're trying to land all these different requirements to see, what that does to our plans. But I would say it's never been as hard as it has now.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks. Before I come to you, Assembly Member Cooper, I just wanted to ask you, London Councils has a figure for how much they think it would cost to retrofit council stock. And that information, I know you don't have it to hand, but it would be helpful for us to see how much the equivalent would be for retrofitting housing association homes, because I think in total the amount of spend, perhaps the committee or others might want to understand what might be the opportunity cost of some of that in relation to new homes delivery, but also looking after our existing tenants, those kinds of pressures. I think that would be really helpful. Just really quickly, it was just more of a comment rather than a question, but you talked about the engagement that housing associations had and used the example of kind of speaking directly to residents on the ground. But just given the vast scale of housing association sizes and types in London, G15 is huge, and there are many which are really, really small. One criticism from tenants is that if that, that is an example of a manager or someone else being on site, how do you continue to have that level of engagement if you don't have people on the ground across your estates?
The answer, we do have people on the ground across the estate, so we do have local housing officers or local housing managers, in terms of however you define that, and more people are moving to the model of smaller patches, more local delivery. That's been a definite shift from a model which was sort of much more centralised to decentralising it to get closer to residents, to understanding their concerns. And I think I suppose the concerns that have been risen aren't just really about housing associations. It crosses into local authorities and other types of providers as well. So I think it's not about just the size of the organisation, because scale can also bring benefits. It can bring better contracts with, maintenance providers, etc. So, there are benefits of scale as well, but it is about making sure you have that local deliverer, eyes and ears on the ground as well.
Okay, no, absolutely. I mean, it wasn't my intention to suggest that wouldn't necessarily apply to councils as well. It was just more what the movement might be, with the direction of travel in terms of kind of zoomed out and being quite remote, or maybe the move back towards being a little bit more on the ground from the G15.
Yeah, I think there's, there's been a lot of discussion. It's interesting because the whole pandemic and local offices, there's even more discussion around what does local mean and how do you make it feel local. But actually, walking around and having those local officers and local housing managers on the estates that are there and more visible has definitely been a movement towards that.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Cooper.
Well, I think there's a strong argument that it's a shame there was ever a movement away from it, but unfortunately that is something that many G15 members persisted in for a number of years. However, that's not my question, that's just a comment. I just want to come to Tom Copley. In February, the Mayor said that he wants to work with social landlords in London to raise standards after it was revealed that over 100,000 homes in London didn't meet the decent home standard, and obviously we're talking about the sort of social rented rather than the private rented sector here. What action specifically is the Mayor taking with that regard to work with the social landlords to improve that 100,000?
The Mayor asked me earlier this year to host a roundtable of social landlords in London to address this very issue. And we had quite a number of both councils and housing associations in attendance, really to highlight the issue, the fact it is a priority for the Mayor, and that the sector does need to address this. We have been lobbying the government regarding the social housing, the social housing regulation bill. As I say, it's something I support. Tony, you were out of the room earlier when I said I'm a glass half full person on that one. But we really want to help the government to shape this agenda. As I say, it doesn't go as far as we would like. But it does contain a number of very, very important measures. And we continue to lobby the government, respond to consultations on all of these things. And I engage regularly with the G15, with London councils, and am raising specific issues of housing maintenance problems with chief execs of those organisations to emphasise that they need to improve what they're doing.
Okay, so it's good to hear about ongoing engagement since the Mayor's remarks in February. Can you tell us about any specific progress that has been made since February? Have we actually seen any improvements starting to take place on the ground?
I think it's difficult to say. I'm not sure we've got data yet. I think the tenant satisfaction measures that are being brought in will help us in future to find out what is happening on the ground and whether or not things are actually improving. But I think it's difficult to say at this stage. Obviously, we still see lots of anecdotal reports of poor quality housing in the social sector on Twitter and social media and things like that. And I picked up an issue with a local council the other day, a particularly egregious example. But I think, these tenant satisfaction measures are going to be quite an important way of us being able to monitor progress or lack of progress that's being made.
Well, as you know, the committee is very fond of targets and outputs and having timescales attached to things. Have you been able to, after your roundtable and your meetings with the G15 and local authorities, do you have a target and timescales over which the 100,000 properties are going to be addressed, 20,000 a year or whatever? So
it's an interesting question. We don't have a specific target on that. This is about pushing social landlords in London to improve and to do better, but we don't have a target on that particular issue.
Sure. I mean, obviously the mayoral team has more than just convening power here because in one sense or another a lot of the G15 and also some local authorities now with your buyback fund are receiving funds from the GLA. Do you ever link these things together, progress on improving existing properties together with the availability or potentially the non-availability of grants for people who can't be bothered to do up their existing stock while still putting their hand out for money to persist in producing new stock?
So we will actually be making an announcement on that very issue very soon, Assembly Member Cooper. I hope you don't mind if I am a little bit circumspect until the announcement is out.
Well, there's only a few of us in the room.
But there's millions of people watching at home, Leonie. Come on. But what I will say is this is something, there are already some measures that we have in terms of withdrawing funding allocations from partners where there are regulatory judgments. There'll be a further announcement about some of this coming up. I'm going to be mysterious.
Oh, well, you can be mysterious. I, for one, will very much be looking forward to that, because I think that has also, apart from the massive expansion programmes that have led to very distant landlords, for example, Clarion, just to name but one. I'm sure Quajo would agree with me on the issue of Clarion. I also think being able to persist in bidding for grant when you're not taking care of your properties that you're managing is not a good thing. However, I shall pass back. I'm going to pass straight over, actually, to Assemblymember Berry.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to go back to Geeta Nanda from the G15. One of the things we did in the Housing Committee in 2019 was make some recommendations about hearing residents' voices. And this was obviously in relation to many things, but obviously standards in homes was one of them. And in response to the recommendations that the committee made at the time, we heard from the Mayor that he was working with the G15 and the National Housing Federation to look at transparency and resident engagement. What happened to that work? It seems like a lot of this stuff has only started this year.
I don't want to give the impression that there hasn't been work that's gone on before. There has been, and the National Housing Federation did the whole Tenants Together engagement, which was really around, working with residents to set the standards and deliver on those standards, and that was taken up by housing associations. So there has been work that's gone on. There has been engagement. There has been structures that exist, and to listen and hear residents' voices. I would say that there has been more of a focus on that post Grenfell for obvious reasons.
Well, our report was specifically part of our post Grenfell response as an assembly.
Yeah, so I would say there has been more of a focus. It's it exists, and people do have all those measures in place where they talk to and listen to their residents and are changing their services as a result of it. So, there is more that can be done. There's always more that can be done. And I think specifically with the changes that are coming into effect, it's making sure, that the regulator has oversight of that on in organisations, as we said earlier. So I don't want to give the impression that this hasn't gone on before, but because it has. People, if we're not only here, we only exist for our residents. So, that is a very important part of everybody's work.
You can understand my point, though, which was essentially that Grenfell shone a new light on these kinds of issues. That report, which came out in 2019, our report came out in 2018, and we got the response from the Mayor in early 2019. Assemblymember Copley was a member of the committee at this point, and not the Deputy Mayor, so our response came from the previous Deputy Mayor. It seemed to indicate work was going on to create a step change, and now in 2022 we are all talking as if we've just noticed and there's a step change that's about to happen. Are there results you can point to from this earlier work? Are there results you can point to from earlier work with the Mayor? Because this was the Mayor's response, who said he was working with you.
I can't point to anything specifically, other than there has been ongoing work with resident groups and different ways of making sure that engagement feeds through into service delivery. That's been ongoing. I don't think there's any report that's required in order to show that is a priority for organisations. Everybody has reports that shows what they're doing in the year. Those are published. There are discussions that happen.
Are you tracking performance and improvement over that period as well?
Yes, that everybody tracks their performance and improvement. I'm not saying everybody's got exactly the same measures, which is why the tenant service measures will be everybody measuring it in the same way rather than in different ways. So I think that will look at maybe some discrepancies that exist across different providers, because they will all be having to make the measures in the same way. But every organisation has measures that they look at.
And across the G15, is there improvement shown in those measures?
There is, in repairs, there has been improvement. So there are, we compare all our data on, the things that are important to residents, particularly around first-time fix. We're also about to pilot an app which we've developed, which is being piloted over the summer by ourselves and one other landlord in Lambeth, which will be where any councillor can put directly go into the app and raise a concern, and it can be answered by the housing association. So there doesn't have to be a chasing within the organisation of response. So we're trying to also find ways to make it more open.
Okay, that's interesting. Can we have as much data as you've got from the G15 group that shows the way you've been tracking the new data on transparency and performance that's come around since Grenfell? Because, like I say, this work has been ongoing for a number of years and should be showing improvement.
We've got, we have got data across the G15 that shows our performance.
Will you share it with the committee?
I'm sure we can, yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Assembly Member Dev.
Oh, no, I wasn't finished. I'm sorry.
Continue, please.
So coming over to Assembly Member, to Tom Copley. I was just talking about you as an Assembly Member, to the Deputy Mayor. What do you think the Mayor has done to respond to the previous committee recommendations on making sure there's transparency and listening to residents about their concerns, which are often about quality and responsiveness to things like repairs? One of the recommendations we made was for a social housing commissioner for London, which the Mayor then rejected, but was something that you supported at the time. Is that something you might revisit if the government continues to resist the idea of a social housing commissioner?
Can you use a mic, please?
Microphone.
I'm able to consider it. I do think, though, there is merit, much more merit in having a national commissioner, because then, they would be able to sit on the regulatory board and have that voice at the table. I think if we were to create a commissioner in London, I mean, obviously the government could just say, well, you can't go onto the regulators board. So, I mean, I think we'd have to think about what then the role would be, how that voice could be heard effectively, and having access to the organisations that they need to. But we'll keep pushing for a national commissioner.
Okay, and then on a similar note, more recently I asked the Mayor if, based on some of the work that we've seen going on in campaigning and social media, and the difficulties you mentioned of having consistent enforcement across different local councils, we asked the Mayor if he might be interested in having a thing a bit like the app that Geeta and Nanda just mentioned, where somebody, a local councillor or resident, can get help in how to make a complaint to the right person, and some kind of oversight of responses that could then go on at a London level. This was rejected, and it seems like the housing associations themselves have taken up this mantle. Is it? I mean, you've just said you want to push the Social Housing Commissioner up to the government, and you want to push this down to the housing associations. Is there not more things the Mayor himself could be doing at a London level to actually work on these issues? I'm not quite clear. Maybe I misunderstand what you mean by the app, but if it's about people registering complaints and repairs, I think it would need. I mean, I think it would be difficult for us to set up something at a London-wide level, given the number of social landlords in London. And we may end up creating duplication with what housing associations and councils are doing themselves. So I'm not quite clear that the GLA is the right organisation to be performing that role. I mean, that is an answer to a lot of your questions today. It has to be said. So, yeah, is there not more... Can I switch over to Geeta now? Is there not more that you would like the Mayor to be doing to support your work, if we're talking about things that coordinate between different housing associations?
I think, each housing association has a responsibility to its residents and its board, for that accountability. So we're independent organisations, we do that. Many local authorities ask for our information, our data around what's happening locally in terms of performance, which we provide to those local authorities. So I think there are mechanisms by which we, at a local level, at a local authority level, where we're providing information, and we give Mayor information as required on diversity, but also diversity of our organisations and how we're improving diversity in our organisations, as well as the performance of building new homes.
I think that's a really important point, and of course in our new affordable homes programme, we do have requirements around equality, diversity and inclusion, which are new, and which I think will help to make some of the improvements in terms of engagement and community involvement that we'd all like to see.
And you said we have to wait for an announcement on further, more robust measures.
Got to keep my powder dry on that one.
Okay, thank you. I think somebody on Devonish wanted to come in before I move on.
Very briefly, I totally agree with A.M. Berry's points. Customer service is so important. Could Geeta actually send us the app details, please? Because I'd be very interested to.
We are piloting it, so we want to make sure we do the pilot to make sure it works. If it does work, we will extend it out. So we have agreed to do a pilot in one borough with a few associations to see how it works, and then if it works, we've been doing all the stuff around data security and information security to make sure it's all that we can start doing that work. So if it works, then it will be extended out.
Okay, you are aware that the number one issue for every London ward councillor is the quality of customer service of certain housing associations. Not all housing associations, some of them are very good, but quite a lot of them are an absolute nightmare, frankly. My question to Tom Copley, you said that you can't do anything else, is, it's almost you have that on the mantra that the Mayor can't do anything on any given subject, of course. But may I suggest...
I think I've set out quite a bit, Tony. I told you about the property licence checkers, the landlord
I'm delighted the Mayor does something for us after 6 years.
There's plenty that we do. It's just about making sure that
Great.
we're the right organisation.
This is a serious point. In terms of all the G15, most are good, but not are, without naming the worst ones. Would the Mayor ever consider withholding money if a particular housing association was not good in terms of their overall customer service?
I think it would be related to regulator judgments, but yes.
Do you think there's any housing associations that are close to that requirement at the moment?
I couldn't be naming. I wouldn't be naming names. So I wouldn't want to say on that front.
We could come back to this at another meeting. So I do think this is in every single councillor's inbox, regardless of party.
Once we've made our announcement, Assembly Member Devonish, I'll be able to say a lot more on this.
When's this announcement going to happen? Can you tell us that?
I can't tell you the specific date, but it'll be soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Boff? Oh, okay, great.
Shall I go back to
yes,
a broader
please.
question about regulation? Because that was also something I was supposed to ask. So the government's made its proposals for a social housing regulator, but the House of Commons Levelling Up Housing and Community Select Committee made recommendations that this should be stronger, that there should be a stronger role for the regulator. So starting with Geeta, do you agree with that? And if, in your view, what kind of stronger role do you think the regulator should have?
I think the current proposals are the right proposals, so that the regulator works, has the overall consumer standards and reviews the consumer standards. I actually think there is a lot of power in individual residents or councillors, local authorities as well, holding associations to account as well as their residents. So I think the regulator, I think it's right that that there is regulation of consumer standards, as well as governance and financial. That's what you're there for. And I think these things will evolve. I do think once the standards are in place and they're being monitored and regulated, then I think those things will evolve. That's what happened last time, and I think it will happen again.
And then Anna Minton, do you have any views on that as well? Like, what's the stronger role a regulator might take than what the government is proposing?
I mean, I'll be honest, I don't think the role of the regulator is my particular area of expertise. I mean, I think there is a perception more broadly, just coming back to issues of trust and engagement with residents, that, you know, and this would apply equally to some housing associations and some local authorities, and indeed other housing organisations. Trust and engagement are not always what they should be, and that has been highlighted in the Grenfell Tower inquiry, and, you know, Michael Mansfield, on behalf of the residents, made it very clear that the residents felt marginalised by the inquiry in the same way that they feel marginalised, you know, too often as tenants. So, I mean, I just, you know, the sort of the broader way in which we approach social housing, I think would make a really big difference to those sort of issues of trust and engagement, and that would cover, you know, a spectrum of sort of macro policies, from regeneration and the popularity of regeneration schemes to, you know, how much real genuine effort is being put into building or acquiring more social housing. So, you know, it's just a sort of whole perception of how tenants are engaged within the sector, but specifically on the powers of the regulator, I don't think that's my particular area.
No, thank you. I totally agree with you. I don't think we've seen that wholesale shift in attitudes towards people in social housing that we were hoping might happen after Grenfell. In fact, we've seen it replicated in far too many ways since then, and I agree with you completely.
Can I add?
Tom, would you like to come in on both those issues?
I'd like to come in and just say one thing that isn't in the bill, unfortunately. I think was promised, but isn't in there, which the Mayor's been calling for, is an Ofsted-style inspector for the social rented sector that would be able to go in pretty much with no notice, and you know, would perform a similar function to what Ofsted does for schools. I think the important thing about that, it wouldn't just be monitoring the housing associations where the regulator is aware that there are issues. It would have the power to look across the board.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we need to move on, don't we?
Yes, we do. Thank you. My question is to all three of you. If I could start with Dr. Minton and go that way. What are your thoughts on the proposed rent cap for social housing, which is open for consultation, and what impact do you think it would have on the delivery of new affordable homes and standards if it was implemented?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of the first remarks I'd like to make about this are just to sort of pick up on comments which were made by Geeta beforehand with regard to local housing allowance and the interplay actually with local housing allowance and rents in the private rented sector, which we didn't really discuss in the time allocated to the private rented sector. But this is such an enormous issue in London, with local housing allowance running at around £200 less on average than private sector rents in London, which means that, you know, on a permanent basis, social housing tenants in the private rented sector, which is a third of all social housing tenants, cannot afford to pay their rent. So that leads to, you know, the choices between heating and eating, rent arrears, frequent evictions. So, I mean, I think that's the sort of baseline discussion, and rent caps in that context actually, you know, it's not going to make much difference. You know, we've got such a severe problem right now before we're even looking at the issue of rent caps, and I don't think this gets anything like the attention that it deserves. I think it's one of the biggest issues actually facing social housing tenants and facing the private rented sector. So I just really like to emphasise that. I mean, the cap itself will, of course, have, you know, a lot of knock-on effects for housing associations and their resources, which, you know, I'm probably not best placed to comment on, but, you know, I know is a massive issue as well, and, you know, will raise many challenges for housing associations' abilities to maintain and their stock and build. But I just really want to emphasise that current issue of that enormous gap, which I think really needs to be dealt with, you know, now, and put right out there now before this winter, you know, gets even worse, because, you know, despite energy prices, you know, not going as sky high as we feared, they're still going to go high, and, you know, people are going to be really affected.
Thank you. Tom?
I think this is an incredibly challenging issue, probably the most challenging issue that we face in terms of the housing sector and the cost of living crisis for social tenants at the moment. There's no doubt that if rents are capped, that is going to mean less funding for new homes and less funding for repairs and maintenance. But equally, you know, a 11+% rise is going to have a huge impact on tenants in terms of cost of living. I think that whatever happens, the government needs to be compensating social landlords for the lost income should rents be capped at below inflation, as we expect that they will. Otherwise, that is going to have a big impact on new supply and on repairs and maintenance. Equally, I agree with Anna. There's a lot that needs to be done through the benefit system, getting rid of the benefit cap. If the government does go ahead and cap rents, it's going to save itself billions of pounds. I heard the figure of £4 billion in welfare payments. That could be used potentially to support the sector to deliver new homes. But this is a very difficult and complex issue. The Mayor will be responding to the consultation.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think we're, as G15, we're deeply concerned for residents about the cost of living crisis. We've seen huge impacts already of how people are struggling, and we're putting in as much support as we can to help people with particularly fuel and food costs at the moment. So some of the figures, we are seeing material for repairs and maintenance work increased by around 16.8% this year. So inflation isn't, you know, it isn't stable across everything, and so we're looking really at the things that are impacting us. We've already talked about fuel. But also the cost of constructing homes has gone up by 11% as well. So we're having very real inflationary pressures on us as organisations. And we know, you know, local authorities are in similar positions, it's not just us as well. But we have pulled some figures together to show the impact of rent cap on G15 members, and at 5% over 5 years, it's 1.174 billion is the loss of rental income, which goes up to 10 billion, just over 10 billion over 30 years. So it's the cumulative impact over many years, and what that means for a rent will be, you know, 5% increase on average would be £6.13 across social and affordable, and £8.54 at 7% increase. So real cost for residents as well, but 68% of residents are in receipt of universal credit or housing benefits. So going back to your point, is there will be a saving on that bill overall. We've also been looking at what the impact will be. There will be an impact on new development. New development will be reduced, and each association is modelling that at the moment in terms of the reduction of homes that they'll be able to build over the next 5 years. Investment in existing homes will be slowed down. So this big push for investing more in our homes, which which is a real priority, will have to be slowed down. Decarbonisation projects, which has been built in, so the savings that we need to find, that again will be pushed out to later dates. And we're as yet to see what the impact will be on our borrowing costs because of investors seeing an imposition of a cap in terms of overall. We have asked that supported housing in particular is exempt from the cap because there would be huge viability challenges for organisations, and it's very difficult at the moment for supported housing to get more supported housing. So we have asked for that to be excluded. And I think what we're trying to do is think of what mitigations, because we know that this is a real problem. We want to make sure that there are mechanisms and means by which we can think about how we can reduce that rent cap or have a cap and reduce the impact. And we're proposing that we reintroduce rent convergence. So there was a mechanism where if your rents are very much lower than the set rent, that you could increase it with an additional £2 per week, so you can bring it up. So at the moment we have all sorts of different rent regimes. So allowing a mechanism for a rent conversion would allow us money back, and it would help with those equitable rents as well across social housing. And whether use of the additional money for housing benefit and universal credit could be used to fund decarbonisation or grants for investing in existing homes, which we won't be able to do. Whether it can cover more of housing associations' building safety costs or support new build in different ways. And there is also an ask that some parts of housing association activity, which is to do with repairs and maintenance, if it was VAT exempt, that would lower our costs overall, which would allow us to continue investing in our homes. So those are some of the impact that we've seen in terms of the hole that it will create for us and some of the things we think could be put in place to help mitigate some of that.
Okay. If I could, just before I okay.
Do you mind if I just add something on this? We're hearing from multiple partners that their board's appetite to enter into contracts, to sign off on new developments is diminishing significantly. And that's inevitably, and a lot of them are essentially pausing taking decisions until they know the outcome of this. So it is absolutely going to have a knock-on affordable housing development in London.
Thank you. So if I could just take advantage of being in the chair. All of the mitigations that you talked about, I think you mentioned, Assembly Member Berry, the difference between outcomes and outputs in relation to the housing debate earlier on. And I just wonder, the total cost to a tenant will include their service charges, and how you are balancing the fact that there are going to be impacts because of the cost of living crisis, but before that, lots and lots of cost pressures caused, through economic circumstances, on your ability to deliver new homes and meet that need for generally affordable homes with the costs on existing tenants and others. And I'm really quite keen to hear what the G15 is doing in terms of mitigating the increases on those service charges along with those rents within the context of the proposed cap on rents that the government's proposing right now.
Yeah, so in terms of service charges are actual costs that are in place. So whether that's gardening, cleaning, whether that's fuel or insurance. And we are seeing all those costs go up. Insurance costs have gone up quite significantly. And I'm talking about shared owners, really, if it's insurance. So it varies depending on if it's a fixed cost with some tenants or if it's a variable service charges, but they are all real costs. What we have been doing is trying to negotiate. So we've been trying to negotiate with our contractors and with our insurers to keep those costs as low as possible. But at the end of the day, we do have to pass those costs on overall, depending on whether they're fixed or variable service charges. And, you know, there is a discussion at the moment, obviously, with shared ownership as well, because that is not included currently within the rent cap discussion. It's really around social housing residents. So we are looking as a group as to you know, what can be done as well to for shared owners. But all of this hinges together depending on what happens with overall income on social housing rent caps. All of these things are combined. So at the moment, there's probably 3 different scenarios going on in every organisation about what they will do depending on what the outcome of these consultations are.
Thank
Can
you.
I just add, sorry, that shared owners actually face a higher increase in percentage terms on the rent that they pay on the portion of the property they don't own, because they're rated by RPI +1 rather than CPI +1. So some of them are facing, you know, close to 20% rent rises.
Thank you for sharing that with us. If I could just ask you before we move on to home ownership, the home ownership section, Dr. Minton, you said earlier that there had been additional interest or renewed interest in the role of regeneration, how that might deliver additional generally affordable homes. I wondered if you might be able to expand on that, your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I was making some broad points, really, with regard to trust and engagement, and referring to the previous decade when quite a lot of regeneration schemes around London aroused quite a lot of opposition from tenants. And then it's well documented that the mayor changed his approach, requiring that tenants be balloted on decisions on new developments. And at the same time, Sean Berry referred to a shift in approach with regard to demolition, especially around climate change, and the sort of a greater desire to refurbish rather than demolish. And so there just seems, I was making some sort of general points, that there seems, it's possible that there's something in the air around, you know, a shift in approach to regeneration. There have also been some landmark legal cases which have also changed the climate within London. And there are some community groups which have come up with some very well publicised alternative regeneration schemes which have involved very strong, very close tenant participation. So really, what I was saying is that, you know, to my mind, in the past, this has been a factor affecting trust and engagement on the part of tenants. To some extent, in some areas, it may well still be the case, but equally, you know, there may be a space opening up for alternative approaches which do work much more closely with tenants. And I think also, you know, the schemes where you see, you know, large amounts of luxury apartment housing with 25% affordable housing, with that affordable housing being at 80% of market value, and, you know, a handful of social homes, you know, those are the sorts of schemes which, you know, arouse a lot of opposition. And, you know, hopefully we're moving away from that.
Understood. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Minton. Before we move to section 4, I understand that you need to go, Geeta. So you're very welcome to stay for the last 3, but equally, if you need to head off, that's absolutely fine. But so thank you very much for your contribution today.
I've got 5 minutes. Do you want me to leave now so you don't?
Oh gosh. If you don't mind, while we just wrap up the last bit, is that okay? Whilst you're doing that, if I could hand over to Assembly Member Devenish for the, if you can hang on for a little bit. Do you want to continue, Assembly Member Devenish?
Thank you, Chair. And this section is titled Home Ownership, so we make sure that we've got the right topic. So starting with Anna and then moving back to the Deputy Mayor. As part of levelling up, please, the government has said it will explore the options to limit the competition that first-time buyers face. What are the barriers for first-time buyers in London, and how will the current economic situation change these factors?
Well, I mean, I think first off, it's the wrong question. We've been asking that question for, the last 10 years plus. What are the barriers to home ownership? And coming up with various schemes to improve, to enable first-time buyers to get onto the housing ladder. Various schemes directed specifically to first-time buyers, which have been widely assessed by economists as having an inflationary impact. So, it would be very concerning if the approach taken was yet more of these first-time buyer schemes, which are going to have a further inflationary impact. To my mind, the answer doesn't lie in more home ownership. The answer lies in more genuinely affordable housing. So, I'm very concerned when I see the question being phrased like that, because that's the approach we've been taking and it hasn't really yielded very many results.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. I mean, I think the direct answer to your question about what are the barriers to home ownership are homes are too expensive and there aren't enough of them. And that's particularly the case in London. So that means, as Anna has said, we have various other products, as we call them, to help get people onto the housing ladder. And the key one, of course, is shared ownership, which the GLA funds. There is an identified need for shared ownership in London. It's an important part of the housing mix, but I think in some ways it's almost partly a symptom of the problem, because you wouldn't need shared ownership, or certainly you wouldn't need it to the same extent, if market sale housing was more affordable. So we need more homes of all tenures, I would say, especially social and council housing. But also we need to be making sure we're building enough market sale homes to try and satisfy demand.
Chair, because it's the time of day, I'll leave it there, apart from just to say I always have to use my wonderful stat I've been using for 6 years, that Mr. Copley's team do actually hold land 16 times the size of Hyde Park or the size of the London Borough of Camden. So I'm sure at another meeting we can explore how he can release
mostly
more of that
TfL
land banking.
And they're developing a lot of it as we speak.
Not as much as they should be, but anyway, I'll leave it there.
Assembly Member Boff.
Are there any specific actions that the Mayor could take to support first-time buyers?
So I can say a couple of things that we've done that specifically relate to shared ownership, because that's where we have the most leverage, as it were. City Hall, like Homes England, now requires a set of 3 key information documents to be provided to prospective shared owners to make sure they're fully aware of what they are signing up to. We've also taken action on leases as well. So in December 2020, since December 2020, the GLA has expected all new shared ownership homes to have 990-year leases rather than 99-year or 120-year leases, and the government has now adopted this as well. So that's a few of the ways that we're supporting shared owners to get onto the property ladder.
Thank you. No progress on common hold when you mentioned it.
Well, this is a source of great frustration, because common hold really should have been the Law Commission, I think, made 121 recommendations a couple of years ago. The government said that they would implement a number of them, but unfortunately we still haven't had that yet. So common hold, as it currently stands, is extremely, the legislation around it is extremely restrictive, and actually means that we wouldn't be able to offer it as things stand as the market sale part of shared ownership. So, you know, we're very keen to do more to support common hold, but it's difficult for us to do it unless the law is changed to make this less restrictive.
Isn't a lot of it the purchasing power of the mayor in terms that if he puts in schemes and insists on common hold, that money would follow?
I think the issue is it's not legally...
Interest from the banks would follow.
It's not legally... Yes, I think the interest is it's not legally possible in terms of attaching it to shared ownership, which of course is one of the main products that we fund.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I just quickly ask you, so you said that shared ownership increases by RPI plus 1 rather than CPI plus 1.
Yes.
Is that a legal requirement, or is that something that could be changed?
We are, in our capital funding guide, we are clear that providers should be migrating to CPI rather than RPI because, well, for a start, the RPI measure is being phased out anyway, but also CPI plus 1 would mean lower increases.
Okay, and I will come to your question quickly. And so, is there a timescale set out for that, or is that something that we could return to here in the Assembly?
We might have to return to it, because off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you.
Because that seems like a bit of a game changer for people facing that right now.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll hand over to you, Sim.
Thank you very much. So, yeah, I just wanted to come back on the question of whether or not we should be focused on home ownership or other tenures when it comes to the Mayor's work. The comment you made earlier where you said homes are too expensive and there aren't enough of them sounded an awful lot like terrible food in such small portions. We do need to be working on other tenures a lot more. And I've looked at your, I know things take time to come through the pipeline, but I looked at your Homes for Londoners portal for affordable tenures of various kinds, including very old definitions. Only 17 of the homes on there yesterday were rental products. You had 538 home ownership type products, including mainly shared ownership, a little bit of help to buy, a little bit of discounted market sale, and one first dibs. So those are the kind of homes that you're offering to people. They are mainly home ownership products still, outside of the social housing sector. And we do, I think, need to be doing a lot better at affordable rented products. Would you agree?
I do agree. Actually, I'm a big advocate for the London Living Rent tenure. I think it offers a really good price point, particularly for people like key workers around that kind of income level. And it's played a relatively small but still significant role in the 2016 to 23 programme. I think it could potentially play a bigger role in the next programme because in the 2016 to 23 programme, it's funded at the same rate as shared ownership, but from a provider perspective, shared ownership stacks up a lot better financially at that grant rate. In the new programme, where essentially it's bidding on a scheme and will have variable grant rates, that should make it easier for us to fund London Living Rent homes, and therefore we should start to see an increase.
Okay, well, we need to do a lot better than having 14 out of 552 homes.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean there are only 14 in existence. I mean, that's just
what's currently
of what's
on offer
on the portal. I, off the top of my head, I can't remember the figure. I think it's around 2,000 to 2,500 London Living Rent homes that have been funded so far.
But the proportions...
I hope I'm right about that.
The proportion's so low compared to shared ownership, though.
Yeah, and I hope I've explained, why that's the case. And now, as we move forward, the situation should improve. But it's a really important tenure, and one which I believe they go like hotcakes, unsurprisingly.
And then very finally, will a stamp duty continued discount help with any of this?
Oh, groundbreaking. Look, I know stamp duty is not a popular tax, and it's perhaps if we were designing the system, or certainly if I was designing the system, we would have a different form of property taxation. But it's. I just don't think it's going to. I think the key thing that it will do is just we'll see house prices and go up. I think that is what will probably happen. So will it make housing affordable overall? No. It might help some people at the margins of home ownership for a short period. But I just we need something a lot more impressive from the government in terms of tackling the housing crisis.
Thank you very much, both of you, for that. And Geeta's left, so thanks to her as well. Before we do wrap up, though, I just wanted to come back to the research that you said your team is doing. If it would be possible to share that with the committee, any surveys or interviews that you have.
I really don't see why not. It would probably be published as a research note anyway. But I really don't see why not.
Great.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one final point.
Absolutely.
Somebody raised the issue of land and mentioned that the Mayor has very large land holdings. I mean, soaring house price inflation is underpinned by extremely high land prices, and local authorities are very big landholders. And I know that Southwark Council, for example, has just launched a land commission where they're going to be looking at their land holdings and looking at how they can expand affordable housing across their land holdings. And, you know, I just want to sort of commend that type of approach and hope that works and hope it may get picked up and draw your attention to it.
They're a big housing delivery borough as well. So last year they started over 900 new council homes, which I think put them top of the tree in terms of local authority building in London.
Thank you. So I don't think we have any more questions from the committee. So I would like to thank you, our guests, for your contributions today. And can we note the report and today's discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from the discussion? Agreed. Can we note our work programme and can we delegate authority to me as chair following consultation with party group lead members to approve the committee's annual affordable housing monitor? Agreed. And the date of the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 18th of October 2022 here at 10 a.m. in the chamber. I have no urgent business and I therefore declare this meeting to be closed.